I'm Rob Trzcinski. This is Symposium, where we talk about the ideas at the basis of a free society. My guest today is Claire Berlinski of the Cosmopolitan Globalist. Thanks for coming on.
You're so welcome. Glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, so I've been before we're going to talk today about Turkey and the earthquakes in Turkey and some of the issues relating to that. But I first want to talk a little about the Cosmopolitan Globalist. I'm a regular reader, a follower and a fan, and the purpose of the Cosmopolitan Globalist is sort of to deal with the fact that Americans tend not to want to pay any attention to anything happening, out in the rest of the world. And your job is to sort of bring that information to us and make it comprehensible, because otherwise we tend to ignore it until there's a war or an invasion or a terrorist attack, and then we suddenly wonder, well, who are these people? Where are they? What's going on? When something big has already happened, when a crisis has already happened, and not beforehand. But one of the other reasons why I like to read the Cosmopolitan Globalist is because the purpose of understanding what's going on in the rest of the world is that oftentimes there are lessons there for what's going on back here and for the issues and the political conflicts that we face. And that's why I wanted to talk with you about Turkey and what's going on in Turkey. Now, first, I want to establish your personal connection or background with Turkey.
I moved to Turkey in 2003, just shortly after what is still the ruling party, the AKP, came to power. And I lived there for 10 years, leaving only after the Gezi protests, which viewers might not remember, but which I certainly remember very, very, very well. During that 10 years, I was a journalist, of course, but I was also an activist working on seismic safety in Istanbul, because Istanbul is right over a huge fault line and completely unprepared. And the earthquake that we just saw is, in fact, not on the same fault line. There are two major fault lines running through Turkey. And as I lived in Turkey, I grew increasingly alarmed because the degree of lack of preparation was unbelievable to me, simply unbelievable, that a country could be facing this kind of risk but not doing anything to protect itself. My interest was heightened after the earthquake in Port-au-Prince in Haiti, where my brother and his family very narrowly survived, just by luck. My sister-in-law worked for MINUSTA, the ill-starred MINUSTA mission in Haiti, and her headquarters building collapsed, crushing everyone in it. And she just happened to be taking that day off. Okay. And after that, I felt particularly strong moral obligation to try to do what I could to help Turkey, because it was by the grace of God that my family survived. And I felt I owed something to the universe.
So that sets the context for the recent earthquakes, because this was not, some unpredictable act of God. This was not something that people ought to have been unprepared for.
No, absolutely not. This is something that everyone knows and has known. The earthquakes are moving from the east to the west as the fault line is aggravated, and Istanbul has a 63% chance of being struck by a 7.0 or more earthquake before 2030. So this is an overdetermined event. Everyone should have been prepared for it. Everyone knows about it. And the degree of heartbreaking, catastrophic death that we've seen in the south is almost entirely because of illegal shoddy construction.
Now, I want to talk about that a little bit more, because it's a little bit like living in California and not building anything that is earthquake proof. That you this is a known risk. It's something that you have to be prepared for, and that if you're not prepared for, residential structures, office buildings, they're going to collapse like a house of cards.
Exactly. It's exactly like living in California, in San Francisco, and building absolutely nothing to code, building things in sort of an anti-code way, in the cheapest, shoddiest way possible. And I found this at the time unfathomable, and I think it's obscene. It's obscene. I think we should be looking at what happened in Turkey not as a natural disaster, but as a mass murder or mass manslaughter.
Now, one of the things also that's part of the context here is there has been a certain amount of economic growth in Turkey. So a lot of buildings have been built during this period of time when they had the knowledge of how to build them, and even funds, as I understand, that were allocated for the purpose of protecting against earthquake risk.
There have been both international donor funds and an earthquake tax that Turks have been paying for the past 20 years. There was a massive earthquake in 1999 centered on Dujne. And if you look in Wikipedia, you'll see that it killed 17,500 people, but that's not correct. They only listed the bodies that were recovered as deaths. And there were about 45,000 people missing. And in the wake of that catastrophe, the government passed really stringent building codes. As with many laws in Turkey, just imported wholesale from other countries. Had they followed these construction codes, they would have been, if not fine, a lot of people would have survived who didn't. But the codes were completely ignored.
No.
Only.
Right. Now, why is that? Because you were involved as an activist in this, 20 years ago. Why was it that this risk was known? It was anticipated. There were laws on the books. Why was nothing actually done?
Because Turkey is one of the most corrupt countries on earth. It's purely a question of corruption and fatalism. The twin combination is deadly. Roger, I think his name Billum, did a fascinating study. I'll get you the link. You can put it in the show notes, showing that the degree to which countries are disproportionately stricken by earthquakes, or a disproportionate number of fatalities, can be mapped precisely to the degree to which they're corrupt. Obviously, not all countries are on a fault line, but any place that's vulnerable when there's an earthquake, if you have anomalous corruption, you have anomalous death. Corruption is a bad thing for society in most cases, but in the case of a country on a fault line, it's deadly.
Now, you mentioned that they brought these earthquake codes sort of imported from other countries, and maybe that's a little bit of part of the problem, because it could be that you're trying to build to California standards without a California level of income, that it's going to become onerous for people to do. But then you said there's also an earthquake tax, which is people were actually being taxed supposedly to help pay for these expenses.
It's not a matter of money. That's an important myth to dispel. Chile experienced an earthquake that was 100 times larger than the one in Turkey. And it was how many years ago was it now? Do you remember it? It actually moved the planet off its axis. It was about 8 years ago, I think.
Yeah, I was going to say 10, but I think 8 is probably.
It should have wiped out the entire country. And if it had been built to Turkish standards, it would have. And there were 560 deaths, which is each one a tragedy, of course, but nothing like what we're seeing in Turkey. You're now seeing the death tolls past 30,000, but I know I'll have Turkish friends who watch this, and I don't want to upset them, but I think it's very likely that it's going to be close to 200,000.
Because as you pointed out, that the number of bodies recovered is a fraction of the number of people who remain trapped or never discovered. And also part of the corruption of it, when you have an extremely corrupt society, is a lot of stuff, official statistics don't get reported.
Yes, exactly. The thing about Turkey, the part about having imported the law code wholesale is very important, because it explains some of Turkey's pathology. When Ataturk and his movement took power, they decided to sever the country very, very abruptly from the Ottoman past to orient it toward Europe. And much of the legal code was imported from Swiss, from German, from Italian law. Great laws, but they did not develop in Turkey organically. And this created a big breach between the public and the legal system that has never been fully resolved. The attitude toward the law is simply very different in Turkey.
Now, we talk about this as being something that goes back to the Ottoman Empire, and you provided me a great link of describing about how offices were routinely sold, and they were sold, and people would buy offices because each office was itself a source of income, right? It was a way for you to shake down whoever was lower on the totem pole than you were, and this is kind of an endemic thing. This is how offices work throughout the world, sort of before the modern era. And it's something that has a very long history in Turkey. So why? But I want to talk about why, particularly this regime, the Erdogan regime, why the AKP, the ruling party, bears particular responsibility for this.
Yeah, the irony is that they came to power in the wake of the 1999 earthquake with promises to clean things up. In fact, the name AKP is a pun, because ak means clean. in Turkish. So they were the clean party. And even people who didn't appreciate their religious message thought, well, at least they're religious people. Maybe they'll be a little more honest. But in fact, they've put Turkey's corruption problem on superdrive. In large part because Erdogan has so completely arrogated power to himself. So there's no checks and balances. There's no competing power centers, but also because, as you point out, there was a lot of economic growth without any commensurate cultural adaptation. And the people who are close to the party, well, the whole country runs on construction money. And the people closest to the party are the ones paying the biggest bribes and the ones who are getting the tenders, the government tenders, often for millions of dollars without, I mean, it's wrong to even call it a tender. It's an announcement after which the company that was already chosen for it is selected. But everywhere in Turkey, you can't build without a bribe. And that's the money that's kept the AKP in power, as they've swallowed every sector of civil society and the media whole. And the civil society organizations that should have been at the forefront of the rescue effort have been crushed. The Chamber of Engineers was crushed. So there's
well, I also want to talk about how they did things like they slowed down Twitter, or they throttled Twitter right at the point when it was being used as a way for people to communicate, to say, hey, I'm trapped, or to coordinate rescue efforts.
Simply an act of evil. I don't think there's any other word for it. They didn't like the way people were talking about how inadequate the rescue efforts were and how much corruption had caused this catastrophe. And as they often do when they don't like the way people are talking, they just they throttled it. It wasn't completely unreachable, but it was too slow for any useful purpose. Twitter is useful generally, but in the wake of a natural disaster, it's essential because phones go down and people can sometimes reach the internet, and they need to be able to communicate to anyone who might get the message. There's someone buried under a building here. They need to be able to say where that is so rescuers can find them. To do that at that time is, I think it's the worst thing the AKP has ever done. I think it's the worst thing they've ever done. And this is I don't have any illusions about the AKP, but that was just an act of cruelty that boggles the imagination.
Now I want to go ahead.
It may be that they're just so ignorant, as they are, that they didn't realize how essential Twitter was, but someone surely told them right away.
Well, that goes to something I want to talk about, which is the connection between authoritarianism and and corruption and the general inability of the government to do anything. It's kind of interesting that there's this sort of paradox there that you think, okay, therefore a big government, a centralized government, lots of power and lots of authority in the centralized hands, and that's going to make them very powerful and able to do things. That's sort of the sales pitch of authoritarianism, is you have a strong man who's able to get things done, and people don't realize the extent to which the very things they do to centralize power and to keep people from competing with them in power also makes it very hard for them to tell what's going on in the country, and very hard to actually do anything.
That's exactly right. Erdogan sold this explicitly on that promise when the referendum was put to the people about whether they wanted to switch from a normal parliamentary system to what he called a presidential system, which basically meant an elected dictator. He said, if you give me all the power, I'll be able to get things done. We won't have all this bickering in parliament. We won't have all these competing power centers. I'll be able to handle everything. And of course, not just in a natural disaster, also as Putin is discovering in a military, you need to have devolved power to get things done effectively. You need to have people at the local level and at the middle management level who are able to make decisions, who are able to assess things for themselves. The centralized power system is exactly the opposite of what you need. Just as in the military, you need people who understand what the main effort is and figure out their own way of getting it done.
Yeah, Tocqueville talked about that a lot with regard to, he was trying to figure out for France how to learn from the American example. And he said, you can't just take the Constitution and all the different laws. You also have to have the habit of this sort of local initiative and individual initiative down at the lower levels, and not everything being
All
organized around the strong man at the top of the pyramid.
That's right. I mean, people might say that France is an example of a highly centralized country, and it is, but France has a very rich civil society, and it has rich traditions of mayorships. It's not like Turkey.
Well, I think it's partly because they took some of Tocqueville's ideas into account after the getting rid of the kings.
Well, it's still quite. Yes, go on.
Yeah, it's more centralized than America. And we have this sort of chaos in America oftentimes that comes from that, of having this federal system and all the different levels of government, but we have a lot of advantages that come from it. Now, one of the things I want to talk about with this is with regard to now this earthquake also hit Syria, and the effects have been even worse there, because the areas of Syria are those, some of them at least, are those that are in rebellion against the government there. So they're outside of government control and outside of government protection. There's really nobody helping them at all.
The amount of suffering they have suffered, I mean, it's as if this region is just cursed. It's unbearable to think that they've got to deal with this now on top of everything else.
On top of 12 years now of civil war.
You've seen the white helmets rescuing people there. Well, they have a lot of experience. That's why they're so good at it. As usual, the government is playing games with people who want to try and get relief into the country. A friend of mine who lived in Gaziantep for several years has started a small fund to help a specific shelter in Syria. And I'm going to send you the link because I absolutely trust that she knows how to get the funds where they're supposed to go. But the problem with a large-scale rescue effort is that Assad will siphon it off, as he does every other kind of humanitarian aid.
Well, using humanitarian aid as a weapon is part of the sort of dictator's playbook.
Absolutely.
So the thing, the contrast in Syria and Turkey, though, is interesting, or the lack of contrast in some ways is interesting to me, because we're sort of used to the idea of outright dictatorship, of sort of a totalitarian regime. And the Assad regime is sort of the leftover of a fascist totalitarian Ba'athist system. We're used to totalitarian regimes having a high death count, a high death toll. They have camps for the purpose of killing dissidents. So we're used to there being, the idea that, okay, tens of thousands of people are killed by this regime because it's totalitarian, it's a dictatorship. I think we're not used to the idea of authoritarianism having a death toll. That because they don't have the concentration camps, they're not as overt in the control. But here, I think what we're seeing is an example of the bill coming due, the death toll from authoritarianism and corruption.
Yeah, what's the key here is lack of rule of law. I've written quite a bit about the kind of figure Erdogan represents. I've called this kind of leader a new Caesar, but there are external trappings of democracy, but inside it's hollowed out. And there are none of the institutions, or few of the institutions, that we associate with the word democracy. There is no accountability. There is no legal system to speak of. There is no protection for minorities. There is no free press. Nonetheless, they have elections, and the elections are more or less free and fair, more or less. What I'm very curious to know is whether, because their elections are coming up in May, I'm curious to know first whether they will have elections or whether Erdogan will find some way to use this to postpone them. And second, whether he's punished by the people for this, as he should be. But the AKP has such complete control over the media and over what people hear in the classroom, what people feel it's acceptable to say. I kind of can't imagine that people aren't able to put two and two together here. They're looking at collapsed buildings. They know this happened under Erdogan. The opposition leader is certainly pointing the finger. I will be extremely surprised if Erdogan survives this.
Well, also, corrupt systems always have this issue of it being an open secret. I think phrase you use is nobody knows and everybody knows, right?
Everybody knows. Yeah.
And I find it fascinating that I've looked into this, and one of the most reliable ways to measure corruption in a society is simply to take a public opinion poll, right? Because if a society is highly corrupt, everybody's been asked to pay a bribe at some point, so they all know it's corrupt, and it's very hard to find other measures. But if you just ask people, they know.
And that's what Transparency International does. They basically do it that way. Their entire corruption perception index is a public opinion poll. It's a little bit, I mean, the index is a little less concrete than they advertise it as being. There's not really any way to disambiguate between, say, Turkey and what's another, I don't know, Argentina or something. But they give you a good sense of whether people think that place is corrupt.
And so because of that, I think, there is this sort of part of the myth of the strongman is the idea that, he has this total control. He controls the media. But at the same time, it's like in the old Soviet Union. The Soviet Union controlled the media, but at the same time, everybody knew, what the system was actually like. Everybody knew how rotten and corrupt it was, and everybody had some, that you couldn't really fool the people over a long period of time. But I think it's interesting to look at that in the attempt to fool people, attempt to keep that control, how that undermines the ability to actually run the society. A great example of this, a parallel to this, is what happened. What they call it authoritarian blindness that happened in China about COVID. That they had people warning them about COVID, and they punished them for warning them about COVID. So the regime literally didn't know what was, had this giant surveillance apparatus, and they don't know the most important thing that's happening.
Exactly, because the local officials don't want to kick up bad news. I thought when you brought up China, I thought you were going to talk about the famine under Mao, which was an example of exactly the same thing. Mao was absolutely convinced that the harvests were great. There was no problem. And it wasn't.
Because everybody kept reporting to him that, we have a record harvest, because nobody wanted to give bad news to the top guy. But in this case, I think, it also has to do with the fact that the power over the media exists in order to protect the corruption, because the whole and the corruption exists also in order to support the regime, because everybody who runs a business needs to have their favor.
Right. And I think it's important to stress that if you are against the regime, if you stand out against them, your life will be made miserable. But if you go along with it, you will be rewarded. It's not all misery under the regime. If you go along, you'll get your contracts, you'll get your permission to build, you'll get they were just mooting in the idea of yet another construction amnesty. They do this regularly. They offer construction amnesties. Don't worry, your building's now been exempt from the amnesty, or been exempt from the building codes. They did this reliably. They did this over and over, and it was very, oh, thank goodness, we don't have to worry about renovating. We don't have to worry about paying fines.
Yeah, and of course, then those are the buildings that collapse. Yeah, I think most Americans don't have a real grasp of this. I think there's a few places in the country where you can get a taste of what it's like to live under that kind of system. I remember my wife dealt with someone who was building a house here in Virginia, and they'd come down from New Jersey, and they were absolutely shocked that, to get the electrical inspector to come look at your house, you didn't have to slip them $100 bill, right? Because that's the way things worked back where they came from. But most people don't live in areas where we don't have to do that. We don't have to slip a guy 100 just to get out of the car. So I want you to sort of get the impression to Americans of what it's like to be in a system with that kind of pervasive corruption.
Yeah, I mean, rule of law for Americans, it's like the water in the fishbowl to the fish. It's just taken for granted, but you sure notice it when it's not there. I'll give you a very specific example, one related to construction. I lived in an apartment that I absolutely loved in Istanbul with a beautiful view of the Bosphorus. And I was working one day at home, and I was annoyed by the construction noise outside, but there's always construction noise outside. And suddenly I heard this enormous explosion, the ground shook. And my first thought was, it's an earthquake. My God, I ducked, covered, held on. And then I realized nothing further was happening, but there were a ton of people screaming outside. I went outside. Turned out the construction company that was working next door had bashed my building in. It was on a hill, and they had simply bashed the supports underneath. The police came, declared the building uninhabitable, too dangerous to go back. So I'm left standing with my 7 cats on the street and nowhere to live. And I got into an argument with the construction company saying, what the hell are you doing? They said, accidents happen. I said, I'm going to sue you to the end of time. They shrugged. Yeah, go ahead, try. After 7 years, I dropped the suit. I mean, because every time it just got, it was always a matter of we needed to pay yet another fee for the court. There was no recourse. Imagine that, having no recourse when someone violates your property. I mean, I didn't own but it was my rental property. When someone violates you like that, there's no punishment for the person who does it. There's no way to be made whole again. I mean, I lost so much money from that because I had to move. I lost 2 weeks of work. And there was nothing I could do. And imagine what it does to a society when people have story after story like this of being humiliated in this way. And there's no functional legal system. There's no sense of, if someone does something like that, they shouldn't be allowed to continue working. And the worst thing about this, or maybe not the worst thing, but a very bad thing, why did they do this? They did it because I lived next to a beautiful old Ottoman bathhouse. And on paper, they couldn't get permission to bulldoze a historic site. So they had an accident. And I was so furious. I was so furious that I went to the Historic Protection Agency, which is responsible for this. And I actually got an injunction against their building. I was so proud of that. I was going to see, you can't do it anymore. You're not going to get rich out of that. They kind of nodded and they kept building.
So you mentioned that being in Istanbul. So that's the other big sort of shoe that's waiting to drop, which is that this earthquake happened off in eastern Turkey, southeastern Turkey. It's also going to be coming to Istanbul, which has a much higher population, a much greater population density. What are you? I mean, must be the thing that you're dreading is the next stage of this.
Some people may mistakenly think that this has taken pressure off the fault line, so it won't be as bad in Istanbul, but it's not the same fault line. And there is a tendency, for reasons we don't really understand very well, for earthquakes to cluster, for one earthquake to be followed by another one. And Istanbul is a mega city, 15 million people, probably more in greater Istanbul, of people who are, I'd say about 90% of the construction is not built to withstand an earthquake. And you can see what happened in much smaller cities with much lower population density when the construction is so shoddy. When it happens in Istanbul, it will be one of the greatest disasters mankind has seen. I've seen estimates of 400,000 dead, but I think that's optimistic. I mean, it depends on the size of the earthquake, but even a less powerful one with a high peak ground acceleration near Istanbul would do unfathomable damage, not just to human beings, but to priceless part of humanity. It's part of our shared heritage. And I think it's really important that when we discuss this as what it is. It's just a human rights outrage. Just as we put pressure on the Chinese for what good it does to cease persecuting the Uyghur, I think the world should put pressure on Turkey to reinforce its buildings, to enforce building codes. I don't see how it's any different. When there's a certainty of a natural disaster like this and you don't take adequate preparation, how is it anything but manslaughter? Second-degree murder.
You mentioned that you'd be surprised if Erdogan doesn't pay some price at the polls for this. But even if he's out of power and somebody else comes into power, how do you deal with? I mean, this is one of the great mysteries of development and of sort of bringing countries up into a prosperous, first world life, fully first world European style lifestyle. Is how do you deal with that issue of endemic corruption that's so deeply rooted into society?
Well, I think Turkey's authoritarianism could be used for good in this sense if you had a leader who was serious about getting the buildings up to code. The way you deal with it, very simply, is you punish people for breaking the law, and you punish them harshly. I don't think that, even before that, you have to have some kind of education campaign, because most people in Turkey don't understand how to build according to code. They don't understand even basic things like what to do if there's an earthquake. There was a picture that was circulated. It was a feel-good picture for most people of someone who was rescued from the rubble in the south and smoking what the caption said, the best cigarette of his life. I understand why people found that a pleasing photo, but in truth, people should know after an earthquake, you can't light up because the gas lines have been ruptured.
Oh, yeah. I don't even think about it.
That should be part of a public education campaign. If it happens, don't light up, however much you want to, because of course, people who are stressed are going to want a cigarette. There's so many things. I went to various local officials and said, do you have a plan for the neighborhood? Do you know how many people are living in this neighborhood? Do you know who would need extra help? Are there people who are vulnerable? Do you have, the roads are probably going to be damaged. Do you have anywhere to land a helicopter in this neighborhood? All these plans need to be made, and they need to be implemented. But first, you've got to have the plan, and you have to be thinking about questions like this. And you see what happens as a result of not having thought about them. There are so many just horrifying stories of people in the South whose relatives were crying out and they couldn't, excuse me.
No, they couldn't reach them under the rubble. Yeah.
They heard their voices going silent. And obviously, if you live in a seismically active area, you need excavator tools in your village. You need them everywhere. So that, that is just the most cruel, haunting horror to think of people. How many people have gone through that, of hearing their relatives' voices grow dim and then stop, even though they survived the quake because they couldn't get them out. It's horrifying.
Well, like I said, I think this sort of shows the death toll of authoritarianism in the sense that because the control of the press is used to suppress criticism, is used to suppress the sort of things that would be used to, you're talking about anti-corruption campaign, it can come from the top down. But one of the ways it also comes is having crusading reporters out there uncovering these things, making the scandals, and then causing the reforms to be implemented. And you have regimes that their control of the press is used to keep themselves in power, and therefore to prevent any of that from being uncovered.
Yeah, absolutely. There was, when I was living there, up until the last few years that I was living there, at the time that incident with my building took place, there was still quite a bit of, the press was still fairly feisty, and that incident was reported. But by now, there's really, I don't know if you've seen it, but we've got video casts from the earthquake zone where they're just getting cut off when they hear someone screaming, "Where is the government? Where is the government?" And people are already being put in jail for criticizing the government. Journalists are already being hauled off, and people on Twitter are already being hauled off. So,
right. So that's the real thing I wanted Americans to sort of understand about this, because I think a lot of this is still being reported as this is a natural disaster story, and it's the unnatural part of the disaster that people need to understand much more fully.
Absolutely, this many people did not need to die. This is a crime. It is not an act of God. It is a crime. I look at the death toll in Chile, compare it to the death toll in Turkey, and you understand how many people were killed by corruption. And if anyone thinks that it's an exciting idea to have an authoritarian ruler who has destroyed the deep state, that's just a term we get from Turkey, by the way.
Yes, I know
the phrase deep state before, but if you destroy
in Turkey, the term deep state, there was a deep state, there was a system that was meant to protect the ruling regime, but the crusade to destroy the deep state ended up creating an authoritarian system of its own.
Yes, that's exactly right. Everyone's noticed now that the military is not rescuing people as they did in 1999. They didn't do a particularly good job of it in 1999, but they did a better job than Erdogan is doing now. And that's because Erdogan has completely destroyed the military as an independent power center, which, if you don't have any other power centers, it's all around the palace now, the palace that he built himself with gold toilets.
Yeah. All right. So that's why I wanted to have you on, and thank you for shining a light on that and letting Americans know what's actually happening out there and some of the lessons to be drawn from that. So thanks for coming on.
You're so welcome. If you live in a seismically active part of the United States, which is pretty much the whole West Coast, bolt your heavy items to the wall, move heavy items away from your bed, and pack an earthquake bag.
Very good advice. I'm Rob Trzcinski. This is Symposium. My guest today has been Claire Berlinski of the Cosmopolitan Globalist. If you found this conversation interesting, you can like us on YouTube, you can subscribe to us as a podcast, and you can find more ideas about the nature of a free society at symposium.substack.com. Thank you for joining the conversation.